Episode 10. It's okay not to be okay. Some countries do small towns well and some countries do them incredibly badly. We have seen quite a few small towns in our short time together in the United States, enough to know that this vast country of 1/3 of a billion inhabitants does pretty much everything under the sun. For today, I have arbitrarily defined a small town as having 1,000 to 20,000 inhabitants. The US has plenty of those to choose from. I used to work in my day job at Help the Aged on a project called Age-Friendly Cities, in which countries around the world assessed a wide range of cities on how well they catered for their older citizens, and on how they rated their quality of life. It turned out to be much more interesting than it sounds, which is just as well, I hear you say. Working on this project, I learned a lot about the ways of the world around the time of the millennium, and I think the lessons it taught me are as valid now as they were then, which may not be saying much. These include: never work on a team where the only other person is your boss. Tokyo, Washington, Rio de Janeiro, Cape Town. These are all cities I didn't need to visit, but the bus did. Instead, I was sent to Coventry, Belgrade, Sarajevo, Belfast. You get the picture, probably quicker than I did. Places where the guided tour took in the recent bomb sites and buildings riddled with rocket grenade holes. This area is where the Serbs killed hundreds of civilians during the siege of Sarajevo, our friendly Bosnian host said. These buildings were bombed by Paddy Ashdown, our Serbian guide cum major cum spy told me, as if it was all Paddy Poundstown's fault, or maybe just a little bit mine as well. In Belfast it was, and here's the Europa Hotel. It was bombed for the 4th time and rebuilt recently, with its own bus station of course, and you know what they called it? They called it the Europa Hotel. There was much shaking of heads, which I hadn't been in Northern Ireland long enough to understand, but I thought it best to join in. As for Coventry, if you grew up there or in Manchester for that matter, you will probably know why it was on my list. The second thing I learned the hard way was that nobody can agree on what old actually is. In England, the academics taking part in the project settled on the age of 65 as the threshold of old age, and then promptly changed it to 75. The Scandinavians agreed with that, as did the Japanese, but the Brazilians wanted 60, to reflect their country's low life expectancy. That prompted the Indians to go 55, but the final straw came from the Central Africans, who said old age started at 35. Faced with the impossibility of finding a figure which suited everyone, the academics did what academics do and declared old age a movable feast, which made logical sense, but was as much use as a chocolate fire guard. In view of our failure to find any meaningful basis for worldwide statistics, I suggested as a joke, of course, that we could standardize the data by using a new measure I called average distance from death. I couldn't believe it when several of the age-friendly cities' academics hailed it as a useful new measure and started using it. I am sure it was not original. Like the oldies themselves, it must have been conceived ages ago, but to this day I still feel guilty. I should have known better than to make a joke at an international symposium, especially as there were Americans present. After that, I decided to keep a low profile and not to propose my pre-Snuffit index, affectionately known as Club 82 Dead. I am afraid my career in the world of aging has been littered with such non-PC moments, like when the shiny new logo for the fledgling charity Age UK first came out and we were inundated with letters from old but clearly not too old people who thought we were a seniors marriage agency. I suggested that this was a role we should consider and I proposed what I thought was a suitable name for it. To this day I don't know what's wrong with calling it carbon dating. If nobody could agree how old was, a consensus on what made a place a city proved equally elusive, particularly after some idiot, not me this time, mentioned the word cathedral. Fortunately, the idea of letting everyone call their town a city proved less problematic. If people wanted to put Tokyo on the same footing as poor Tajlo Prairie, where was the harm? It turns out the harm was that it provided our colleagues from the University of Kobe with very little common ground for drawing up a checklist on what made a place age-friendly, which was rather the point of the exercise. If London wanted to include the state of pavements as a key indicator and Udaipur said what's a pavement, if Okinawa wanted to measure the availability of fresh fish to the over 90s and Kigali wanted an indicator on the risk of being shot before becoming a grandparent. Well, you can see the problem with a common scorecard to judge cities worldwide, and all these problems paled into insignificance compared to the finding of one of the working groups that the characteristics that made a city age-friendly were pretty much the same as the things that made the place good for people of all ages. This may make intuitive sense, but it was corrosive to our project. If all we could do was raise a bit of awareness and tinker round the edges, was the whole endeavour anything more than a way of keeping my boss and his cronies well-travelled and well-dinnered? Well, no, not as far as I'm concerned, and I hope you will profit from my experience too. I now have a mental checklist in both senses, with which to judge cities, and I'm not afraid to use it on small towns. I have taken my colleagues' advice and not worried about age either. Anyway, I am now in my 69th year, with a life expectancy of 63 living in my head and in my bed, suspended in the overhang of the sheets and hanging on for grim death. So forgive me if I don't split hairs or take any prisoners. I have chosen 3 small country towns, all isolated enough for them to have to stand on their own 2 feet. You will be pleased to know this is not about reduced gene pools or why incest makes the heart grow fonder. There will be no tasteless jokes about webbed feet or locals high-sixing each other in the street. For today, I want to explore a very different pool, the talent pool. The first small town I lived in for any length of time still showed signs of being an overgrown village. It would not be fair to name it, but Altaussee is a pretty place in central Austria, touristy in the summer but still relatively unspoiled because the terrain is unsuitable for skiing. Plenty of snow though, which added to the feeling of being caught off. I first went there in the late 1960s and spent 2 months every year there. It has probably changed considerably in the intervening years, but it still has the usual quaint houses, wonderful scenery and even its own lake, originally called Altaussee. That should have been a warning that this place had a serious word shortage, a shared vocabulary incapable of describing anything except manure. Within these confines, the good people of Altaussee could run the full gamut from bovine Kushisa by way of babies and chickens to the equine Rosepfel. The inability to express anything about God's creatures other than what comes out of their bottoms is not unique to this town, nor does it have anything to do with the local dialect, underneath a thick layer of folksy disguise, which was useful for excluding the tourists. The language they were speaking was a cut-down version of Standard German. The inhabitants genuinely had no good way of expressing their feelings in words. So all they had left were physical manifestations of their angst, which in this town meant alcoholism, domestic abuse, driving too fast and mountain climbing, sometimes all at the same time. Certainly, alcohol played a leading part in all of them, but that's a story for another day. My point is that this is a familiar story in small towns throughout the world. Circumstances may vary, but the underlying problem remains the same: lack of verbal self-expression, which in turn is one element of the lack of local talent which characterizes these places. Generally, the arts are a step too far for them, but this doesn't stop them. They have delusions of adequacy, and Altaussee had it in spades. Not content with a light horror operetta, they went for the full-blown Italian opera, in the hope of attracting the world-famous conductor Herbert von Karajan, who had a summer villa nearby. Not a sorbet's chance in hell, I'm afraid, not just because the last thing he wanted was a bus conductor's holiday, not even because he had an aversion to being associated with a caterwauling bunch of talentless yokels. To cap it all, the older inhabitants always referred to him as that bloody Nazi. He wouldn't be giving them a sight of his baton anytime soon. Undeterred, the locals pressed ahead with their plans. This year's victim was the opera Cavalleria Rusticana, which they translated as the horseman got botulism. As I said, they weren't very good at naming things. It turned out they also weren't very good at singing. This year's vintage wine came courtesy of the headmistress, a prima donna from the ears pierced while you wait school of music. A fact which even the mayor had to admit during a rare respite when Pratt and Whitney Houston wasn't singing. He could clearly be heard whispering, "I had a garden gate like that." The tenors were little better, and the shortage of volunteers meant that Liesl, the barmaid, got a leading role, which she managed better than some of the male tenors. She strayed into baritone a few times, but the audience applauded wildly when she did her party trick of carrying 10 full beer steins in each hand. Well, strictly speaking, it wasn't in the libretto, but 20 litres of free beer were never going to go amiss. Even so, I wasn't prepared for the shock of hearing people say on the way out that at least it was better than last year. I wonder what that was. Deaf Ida, the tragic flute, murdering Mozart in the park. And this picture-perfect Austrian country town is not a one-off. In fact, it sets a very low benchmark for the sort of place that has enough history to attract tourists craving entertainment but nowhere near enough talent to provide it. There are places where this benchmark is easily undercut. Places like Tombstone, Arizona. You will have to take my word for it, because we are heading north from Yellowstone, and even I'm not going to take you on such an insanely long detour just to prove a point. We should have smelt a rat as soon as we got out of the car. I don't know if this area was originally part of Navajo territory, or if another Native American tribe had a better claim to it. It would have made no difference to the town clerk and the dustman, who were proud of their Navajo descent and had the costumes and superannuated bongos to prove it. The drummer and the dancer had less rhythm than the average pope, but when they started singing, things went down to a whole new level. The town clerk delivered the coup de grace when he got out a wooden flute with no holes in it. The overall impression of two cats fighting in a sack was now complete, and I have to admit that I felt a sudden lifting of the spirits. It took a while to realize this was because they had stopped. They came over for a chat. Oddly, we were the only people there, and we found out that the performance came courtesy of the town. It was laid on to entertain the tourists, but they preferred to call it an authentic recreation rather than entertainment, which was something we could wholeheartedly agree on. Thud and Shuffle, as I like to think of them, recommended the town's better-known historical reenactment. They even explained why there were 2 shootouts and 2 OK chorales, and why one was more OK than the other. The Tombstoners were more realistic about their acting skills than their Austrian counterparts, and the staging of the gunfight at the OK chorale mercifully involved no singing. All the cast had to do was talk loud and shoot straight, 2 things the locals should have managed pretty well. Unfortunately, most of the inhabitants were doing other things, or so they claimed, so the available talent pool was just a couple of inches of murky water. The Clantons and the Earps were out in strength in the 2 theatres, and they needed every available man to play them. The loud talking thing would have worked better if they had occasionally faced the audience. Although the few bits of dialogue I did catch seemed to consist of lines made up on the spot and repeated until the shooting started. If the spoken bits were less ad lib and more ad nauseam, the gunfighting was even more disappointing. The actors knew how to handle pistols and shotguns, no problem, but it would have helped if the audience had known who was shooting at who and why, or if the cast members had remembered who they were supposed to be playing and stuck with that character throughout the performance. It would also have been nice if the people who were killed would have had the good grace to lie down and stay dead for a decent amount of time, but I will leave the final word to the little girl on the row behind me, who asked in a piercing voice, "Mum, is Virgil Earp supposed to shoot his brother?" I will leave you with this question to ponder on our long drive to the Canadian border. Does it actually matter? I mean, does it matter that Altaussee can't sing and Tombstone can't act? Should we not be glad that everyone in these towns has the opportunity to shine, regardless of ability? And if you decide that it is okay, are there any lessons to be learned by the dysfunctional small towns that you will soon be visiting? Let's wait until we have all had a look at our 3rd town, shall we? It won't be long now.